purpose of this video is to show you the basics of handmade paper. To begin making paper, you will need a kitchen blender, some kind of recyclable paper, and a surface which separates pulp from water like a sieve would. The purpose of the blender is to break down the dry paper into a wet state from which it can be reformed, or in other words, recycled. This just means rearranging the same fibers in a different manner. A blender works well because it breaks down the paper and redistributes the fibers. The next step is to suspend the paper fibers in a vat of plain water. You don't need to add any kind of glue to reform a sheet of paper. Paper fibers will form an electrochemical bond called a hydrogen bond. Individual fibers connect with each other, and as the water is removed, the bond becomes stronger. Cellulose is the main building block for making paper. It is found in every plant and is the part of the plant which allows this bonding process in paper making. Small divisions of the fibers, called fibrils, form the hydrogen bonds that hold paper together. Cellulose is made from carbohydrates. The hydrogen and oxygen atoms in cellulose always occur in the same proportions as in the water molecule H2O. That's why adding water has such an effect on a dry sheet of paper. As long as water is present, the paper is vulnerable and easy to tear. When all the water is squeezed out of it, it will be a dry sheet of paper that you can use to write on or to draw on. As you saw, I just took computer cards and a kitchen blender and a dish pan, and an old towel, and the screen that I used was a wooden frame with fiberglass stretched on it. Later in the equipment section, I'll show you how to construct a rectangular frame. All you really need is some kind of framework to hold a filtering surface. You can also use an embroidery hoop and trim the excess fiberglass off of it. So you really don't need a lot of equipment or materials to get started in making paper. This pulp right here is something even more simple. It's a paper towel, a simple paper towel. And it was put in the blender. And you can make a sheet the same way. When you squeeze out the water, you're helping to form a hydrogen bond. These bonds are formed because plants contain cellulose, a basic building block of all plants. Cellulose is found in its purest form in cotton. That's why cotton is such a good source for paper making material. You can see how hard it is to pick up this wet sheet of paper at this stage. It still wants to tear apart since the bonding has not been completed. So this is what a wet sheet of recycled paper towel would look like. After it's dried, you can see the differences between the dry sheet and the wet sheet. The wet sheet is still somewhat transparent, and the dry sheet is more opaque and much stronger. Even though it can still be torn apart, the bonds hold the fibers together and become stronger as the sheet dries. It takes a lot to tear it, but with the water in it, you just pull it apart. And that's why they're very concerned with wet strength of paper when you buy, say, paper toweling or industrial paper. They rate the wet strength. But see, even though that had been dried, when you put it back to water, it breaks apart. I've already shown you how to make paper by recycling. You can also take raw materials and break down fibers to make other kinds of paper. Wasps use wood fiber to make their nest. They digest the raw material from dry fence posts and other wood. Observation of the paper that wasps made led to experimentation with wood pulp. Today, most of the paper we use is made from wood pulp, so the wasp played an important part in history by inspiring man to use wood for paper. Here, with light shining behind it, you can see the pattern in which the wasp made its paper. The nest is water resistant because of the way it is constructed of overlapping sheets like shingles, and also because of a natural chemical sizing which the wasp adds to chewed up paper pulp. This is another form of natural paper made from seaweed in a bay off the Northern California coast. The fibers were matted together as the seaweed washed back and forth with the action of the tide. The bay acted like a giant vat, forming this paper-like material. Although it is thick and more like felt in the middle, on the edges where it is thin, you can see how much it resembles paper. Paper can also be made from fibers of trees such as this mulberry tree. In the United States, it is known as the paper mulberry tree. In Japan, the mulberry bark is known as kozo. This is a sample of the processed Japanese fiber with some of the darker outer bark still attached. In the preparation of kozo, this outer bark will be scraped off, leaving the long inner bark fibers to form sheets of paper. Another variety of kozo is cultivated in Thailand. Each variety will produce slightly different qualities of paper. Subtle differences in climate, location, water quality all affect the length of the fiber and thus the resulting sheet of paper. This sheet was made from kozo. You can see how thin it is. Even though it's thin, it's very strong because of the long fibers which reach out and bond with each other. They aren't built up like a mat as in other shorter fibered papers. Since this was made on a Western mold, you can see the pattern of the screen on which it was made. In Volume 4, I'll go into greater detail about the techniques of Oriental papermaking. Other Oriental plants and trees provide fibers for papermaking. This paper is made from Mitsumata. The plant contains a bitter chemical, so paper made from it is naturally insect resistant. This paper was made using a traditional Japanese mold called a su. You can see the lines that were made by the bamboo screen. As with kozo, you can make thin sheets due to the long fibers. When you compare Western and Oriental papers, you can listen to the difference by shaking it. Although Mitsumata makes beautiful paper, due to difficulties in harvesting and sheet production, it is not as popular as kozo for paper making. Gampi is another fiber that is used for making Oriental paper. Since it cannot be domesticated, it is not as readily available. In order to find Gampi fibers for paper making, you must find the plant growing in the wild. All three varieties of Oriental papers are boiled with soda ash to break down the fibers so that they can be separated. Instead of putting this kozo in the blender to cut and macerate the fibers, they will be hand beaten. After boiling, the fibers must be rinsed to get out all traces of the soda ash and also to pick out remaining specks of bark. After rinsing, I usually squeeze out the extra water and store the small fiber balls in plastic bags in the freezer until I need to beat it out into the paper pulp. The main difference in Western and Oriental papermaking is in the raw fiber material. The long fibers must be handled differently from cotton or wood pulp in the process of making a sheet of paper, and so the equipment differs slightly. You can also use native or indigenous plants and trees to make paper. These cattail plants can be boiled down like Oriental fibers so that you remove the lignin and other non-fibrous material. Cellulose is the part of the plant that you want to use. Lignin is something like a natural cement that holds cell walls together. Lignin will cause your paper to discolor, so you need to remove it in the boiling process. The intersection is where the fibers are located. When you dry the leaves and break them open, you can see the network of fibers. Here you can see the paper made from the cattail leaves. The leaf will break down in boiling, leaving the pronounced fibers. Although this paper is not very useful, it does give you an idea and an opportunity to experiment and try different fibers. When trying out plant material for paper, look for these papers in the stems, leaves, and inner bark of trees. This is a piece of the cattail leaf after it has been boiled. Most of what's left is the fiber, which can then be put in the blender or hand beaten to form the pulp. The fibers aren't as flexible as the Oriental fibers, so the paper may be too brittle to use in most instances, but you can add interest to other pulps like cotton by introducing these fibers for decorative purposes. Here's the leaf of a gladiolus flower. You might want to try any plant that you can get in large quantities. Check with your florist for discarded flowers to experiment with leaves and stems. What you'll want to look for are these noticeable fibers. You can keep records and samples of the plants you use. This would be a good science project for individuals or as a class. The book, Plant Fibers for Papermaking by Lillian Bell, is a good reference book. It gives examples of many varieties of plants that you can use for paper and also gives instructions for preparation of the fibers. Almost any kind of plant can be used to make paper or to add texture. Although most people think of papyrus as being the earliest example of paper, it actually isn't paper in the sense we know it. Instead of suspending fibers in a vat and redistributing them on a mold or screen, papyrus is made by systematically placing the reeds of the papyrus plant in rows and alternating the direction of the fibers in layers. Here you can see the distinct lines of the fibers. Papyrus is more like woven fibers than paper. Still another way to make paper is by cutting up cotton or linen material into tiny squares and using your blender. You will need to cut the material into squares smaller than 1/4 inch and let them soak in water to soften them. If the threads of the material are too long, they will get tangled up in the blades of your blender and burn up your motor. This is one way to add color too. It adds texture, since it also adds the individual threads, and sometimes they show up in the paper. Here I added red corduroy material squares to white pulp. When adding material, try to use only natural fibers such as cotton or linen. This is a linen towel cut up. This sample was made from linen that had a yellow pattern in it. It is a little more crisp than the cotton, and it still won't have that snap that the longer fibered paper has. This was made on the Oriental mold using the bamboo screen as a filtering surface. You can see both the texture for the lines of the bamboo and also the texture of the individual fibers of linen. This is another example of recycling, using linen and cotton as your raw material for paper. Again, when you're finished, squeeze out the water to store your pulp. Many people ask if my paper is made from dryer lint. You can make paper from dryer lint. That's how I got started as an experiment. You'll find, however, that most of the time lint will clump up too much in the vat to make a good even sheet. As with some plant fibers, you might want to just add lint as a decorative element. Since lint is made up from many different fibers, you can't control the results, and you'll end up with an inconsistent quality of paper. You wouldn't be able to get a thin sheet of paper like this made from kozo. The fibers will more likely mat on top of each other in layers instead of reaching out across the surface. Here is a sheet made from dryer lint. Up close you can see the texture of the screen. In paper that is matted and thick like this, you will tend to get more of an impression from the screen. I added lint to white cotton pulp for texture and color. This is not the best material for paper making, but it's worth trying. I've mentioned that cotton is a good material for paper making. This is because it's almost 100% cellulose. I wouldn't suggest using cotton straight from the plant like this. The fibers of cotton are called seed hair fibers, and they need to be processed to remove all the seed particles. That's the purpose of the cotton gin. The long fibers won't distribute evenly like the oriental fibers, and you'd probably end up with a sheet of paper like this. This was one of those experiments that demonstrate that not everything makes a good sheet of paper. You can see the unevenness of the sheet and how the fibers tend to clump up instead of reaching out to each other. These are processed sheets of linen, cotton, and abaca, probably the best way to obtain your fibers if you plan to make a lot of paper. You have to soak the sheets in water to soften them, and then you can process them in a blender. You'll need to order these processed fibers from the suppliers in the booklet. This is the cotton linter that I use to make white paper. This is probably the easiest way to make it. It's already processed. What cotton linter is the seed hair fibers from the cotton plant. When it goes through the cotton gin, they use the longer fibers for various things, for material and cloth, and then the shorter fibers are really not long enough to do anything else with, so they make paper. And this is processed and it comes in a sheet. You can buy it in sheet form, or you can buy it in pulp form, already hydrated with water. And then in the sheet form, you just tear it up into small pieces, put it in your blender with a full blender full of water. And the secret is to use plenty of water, because the more water you use, the easier it is on your blender motor. Then you just turn it on. I put it on a medium speed. You blend it up till it gets about like that. And then you pour it into your vat. I've explained some of the materials that you will use and how to prepare them. Now I need to show you the equipment you'll need before we can actually begin making paper. To introduce equipment, we'll start with the mold and decal. This is the mold, this is the decal. The mold and decal are the main tools you'll need in order to make a flat sheet of paper. The mold is the screen surface which filters the pulp from the water. The decal is a frame that sits on top and forms a reservoir that keeps the pulp from draining off the side of the mold. Some molds rely on joints, not nails, to hold the corners together. This allows the wood to swell and make the joint even stronger when wet. On this mold, polyester screen surface was attached to the framework with heat. It was stretched and heat sealed to form this taut surface. It's important to keep the surface stretched tightly across the framework so the weight of the water and pulp don't pull down the screen from the frame. For a much simpler mold, I'll show you how to stretch fiberglass screen and staple it onto a wooden frame. In smaller molds, you don't need to worry about support underneath the screen, but larger molds may need to be reinforced. To make your simple mold and decal, you'll need to make 2 identical wooden frames. I use 1x1 strips of wood and cut the corners at 45-degree angles. You can find these small corner clamps at the hardware store. First, you need to apply wood glue to the corners and then set the pieces in the clamps and tighten them until they fit together and make a good seal. When you get them positioned properly, then you nail them together using brass nails if possible. Try to use materials that won't rust, since your equipment will be in water a great deal of the time. Rust can show up as brown spots in your paper, called foxing. This is why you use fiberglass screening instead of window screen. It sometimes helps to drill a pilot hole for the nails. I usually put 2 nails to make the corner stronger. Just tap it in. You'll end up with a finished corner like this. When you get 2 corners, you can then put them together and connect the frame. If you have 2 sets of clamps, it will speed up the drying time, especially if you're making several different sets and sizes of molds. The size of your paper is determined by the inside dimensions of your wooden frame. After you've finished making 2 frames, one for the mold and one for the decal, you'll take one and cover it with screen for the mold. Cut a piece of fiberglass screen a few inches larger than the outside dimensions of the frame. It would be good to use stainless steel staples, however, you may not be able to find them. Staple the screen tightly across the outside edge of the frame. Begin stapling in the center and work out to the edges. Be sure and stretch the screen as tightly as possible. I always start in the middle. When you finish, this is what you'll end up with. If you can find 2 small wooden picture frames, you won't have to construct your framework. Just staple screen to one for your mold. Now that you've made your mold and decal, you'll need to find a blender to process the paper pulp. If you're using cotton or recycled paper, you can use your kitchen blender, but be sure to fully disassemble and wash it thoroughly before using it to process food. As long as you're not adding chemicals or dyes, you should be able to use your kitchen blender. But you might want to buy a second-hand blender if you plan to make a lot of paper. By cutting these plastic jugs, you can make storage containers inexpensively and help to keep paper-making containers from getting mixed up with food containers. Another recycle tool is this plastic bottle top, which can be used as a funnel. Some things about your studio: when you're storing your mold and decal, you don't want to have them leaning up like this or laying on something like that, because they'll warp. So when you store your mold and decal, you want to lay them flat on a flat surface, and you can lay them on top of each other as long as they're not pushing down into the screen of the next one, as long as there's framework for them to rest on. I use a lot of plastic containers because plastic won't rust. These buckets and containers will always come in handy for storing extra pulp and water, and later for use in storing dyes and other chemicals. That's why it's important to mark them on the bottom so they won't be returned to the kitchen. Something that's very important are your tubs or your vats. Now this is a large one. This is like a busboy's vat. You can get them at the restaurant supply stores, or some of the wholesale discount places. You can get them in different sizes. You can get large or the medium here, or you can get these small ones. You usually find those pretty easily. The one thing you want to remember about your tub is that it will have to fit the mold that you're sticking down in there. This is not large enough for this mold. This mold, you really don't have enough room to manipulate the mold in this vat. So you need the next size up. Now that size would be okay for this size mold after you stir up your pulp. See? But you have to make your mold fit the size of your vat. This is just a sink cutout from a Formica countertop, and it's just about the right size to work on. It's not too heavy. You can pick it up, move it. If you're working on a surface and this happens to be the surface that your paper's drying on, you can move it. You can set it in front of fans. I think this is probably one of the most useful items that I have in my studio. I like to make a little platform for my blender to sit on, because if you, in the course of your pulping, oftentimes the water will overflow and you'll be all wet, so I like to have a little place. Now the problem is, if you have a place to contain the water, then there's always the chance that the water will get back up in your electrical appliance. So that's why I have this little platform that it sits on. This way the water does overflow, but it's contained, yet the blender's up out of it. When you're making your mold and decal, you might just make an extra decal for your blender. Some of the items that you might have around the house that you want to use: your drill with the paint stirrer. You have a spray bottle. These come in handy, like when you're molding paper over a form. You can just spray your pulp down and it'll go fill in over your mold. A brayer for attaching your sheets to the Formica boards. 5-gallon buckets are real handy, especially if you're not in a place where you have a sink or a water source close by. If you're working outside, you can use these as little temporary sinks. When you're washing something off in a regular sink, you'll have to worry about all the paper pulp going down your drain. That will clog up a drain real quick. So if you use like a wastewater bucket, then you can rinse off the pulp. Then you can take your mold and decal to the sink. You'll need a surface on which to form the wet sheets of paper. Denim blue jean scraps can be used as felts when you're making smaller sheets of paper, but any heavy absorbent material will work for felts. An old army blanket cut up into squares is probably the best felt material. Be sure to keep your screen on top of the frame when dipping the mold into the vat, otherwise the pulp will be trapped inside the mold framework. If you want clearly defined edges on your paper, you'll use a decal on top of the mold. As you lift your mold and decal out of the water, you'll see how thick the pulp is on the screen. When you turn your mold over on top of the felts, you're going to press out a lot of this water. You might want to use a sponge when you're first starting to make paper. As you get accustomed to handling wet sheets, you may find that you can form sheets without sponging off the back. Larger molds will have supporting ribs underneath the screen surface of the mold, and you won't be able to sponge off the excess water. You can see as I lift off this sheet that the paper is very fragile at this point. This sheet is a little thicker than normal, so I'm able to pick it up. The felts are important because they allow you to handle the paper while it's in this vulnerable stage. As the water is removed, the paper becomes stronger. Here you may be able to see the texture from the screen of the mold. If you want to get rid of the screen marks, you can transfer the sheet to a smooth surface like glass or Formica to dry. Another thing that's good to have is a brush. These are good to put the paper onto the flat surface to dry. Take a brush and brush it onto the board, and then you dry it. You can either set it in front of a fan or just set it out in the sun. If you'd like to get some of the excess water out, you can use a brayer. But you have to be careful that you don't push the paper pulp too far out of line there. And that will do two things. It will squeeze out the excess water, and it'll also make the surface smoother. And after it dries, when you peel this off, it's a very slick surface on the paper. You could leave your paper on the felts and let them air dry on wire racks, but this will take longer because you'll have to allow extra time for the felts to dry as well. Watch for signs of rust on your racks, since rust will contaminate your felts and show up on your paper. This is another way to do the same thing, and you won't have to worry about rust. It's like a fluorescent light fixture, and it's plastic, so you can cover this whole thing with paper and set it out in the sun to dry. And again, you can use this as part of the texture. You can put your paper, wet paper on here, press it down in there, and you've got a grid texture. You can recycle equipment such as plastic containers, old towels, and aprons to hold down your cost. And a plastic garbage bag. Now, you can have more than one garbage bag. If you have an area that you don't want to get wet, then you could slip like a box top or something in here to give it a little ledge, and you could use this as a tray, or you can stick it against you like this and tie your apron on, because your apron will get wet, and when it's wet, there's no point in having an apron on. When you start to add color and additives which might be toxic, it's especially important not to return those containers to the kitchen. You should not eat or drink in the area where you'll be working. By using disposable and recycled containers and staying alert when working with water and electricity, you should develop safe and sensible work habits, especially if you'll be working with children. Now it's time to use the materials and equipment to demonstrate the technique of making a sheet of paper. Here I'm blending part of a sheet of cotton linter into cotton pulp. Blend it up till it gets about like that. And then you pour it into your vat. Okay, now this is a little bit more pulp than necessary for that amount of water. This is a mold and decal. This is a homemade version. It's got the screen wire stretched across the wooden frame. This is the mold. This is the decal. This is a different kind. It's the same basic idea, but you can see that this is all one piece. There's no staples or nails as like are in this one. This is just for beginners to try. This is also screen stretched across and heat sealed, whereas the screen on this one is stretched and stapled. This is the mold, this is the decal. The reason you have a decal is to hold the fibers on top when you dip it into the vat. Kind of provides a tray for the fibers to settle around, and then there is your paper. Okay, this another way to start, if you don't want to get too involved with your cotton linters, if you just want to try it out, you can use any kind of paper. We'll recycle. You can break it down in your blender the same way you do the cotton. This is computer cards just like this. The problem with other paper is that it has sizing in it, and it can gum up some of your equipment. So I let it soak a little while, and then same thing. Probably you don't use very much paper. Be sure and use plenty of water. I usually use 12 cards per blender full of water. Again, you've got the same thing now. You can still see a little bit of the computer printing on the cards, so it probably needs to be beaten a little bit more in the blender. Now, this paper is not as fibrous as the cotton is. You can see that it has longer, even though it's the shorter seed hair, it still is longer than this processed paper. This will hold together a little bit better, but just to start out, this is a good way to inexpensively experiment. Now you add, just to do the computer cards so you'll get an idea, add it to the water in your vat. Then what I use for felts is an old army blanket. You should dampen the felt so that the paper pulp adheres to the felt surface as it comes off the mold. Okay, again, your basic process is to take your mold, this side up, and your decal, dip it down in the vat, you can see the thickness of the paper there. Then you just cooch it onto the felt. This is called cooching. Now, you don't have to use a sponge, but beginning it probably helps when you're a beginner to sponge out the excess water. Then that way, now you can see what your sheet of paper looks like. Now, this is an extra thick sheet, so I can pick it up like this. Now, these little specks in here should have been blended a little bit better. You do get a texture from the screen there. And if you wanted to, you could press it out later. Now, to show you what the cotton does, you can make paper without the decal. And you see it's very gloppy. There's too much in here. When I have too much pulp in it, in my vat, I kind of squeeze it out, put it off to the side. This is kind of helpful when you're making colored paper. If you want to make a batch of paper that's all the same color, rather than make a vat full and then go back and try to match the color, I make an oversized vat full and then scoop it out like this, put it aside, and then that way you guarantee that all the paper will be the same color. Okay, now, again, this is without the decal. Do another one. You want to make sure that when you dip it down into the vat, it's an even. That one's not as even as it should be because there's still too much paper in here. You can see I'm scooping it in and out. There's a lot of different techniques to doing that. The main thing that you want to do is keep your paper pulp nice and even through the whole thing. You want to shake it up, you know, swirl it around to make sure that you got an even amount of pulp. And then when you pull your mold up, then that's pretty even there. It's still clumpy, but that's because it's cotton linter and it's That's the nature of it. Okay, again, you can do it with or without a sponge. Okay. You see, without a decal, you see the very fluffy edges you get there. Okay. I'm going to squeeze out a little bit more water so I can pick it up. You can also leave it on the felt and set it out in the sun to dry. It won't have that smooth side that you get when you put it on this board. Had some little pieces of stuff. That's one thing about making white paper. You have to be very careful not to get little black specks in it. Okay, now that was without a decal. This is with the decal. And again, because it's real thick, it's a little bit fluffier than normal, but now if you're doing this in production, see the difference there? What you would do, and reverse the order of the felts from what I've got here, you would start like that, and then you would lay another felt on top of it, make another sheet of paper, lay your felt down, make another sheet. Now this is what you do if you don't absorb the water like that. So you have to find a place to work where you can afford to have everything get wet, because it's a very wet process. One thing that helps is you can get a little tray to put this in, and that way it helps to keep the water from running everywhere. A big cat litter tray, and you don't have to make them this large. You could cut, if you have a smaller mold and decal like this one, then you could cut your felts in half or in quarter, whatever size to fit your mold, and then you could work very small but make a lot of paper at once. So you don't have to work very large to get something done. Now, I'll show you some of the problems when you're making paper. Like this one, I've already showed you about unevenness. And also you have to worry about your pulp flopping around. Okay. Another thing that happens, if for some reason you get drips on it, that's what happens. And that's a defect in your paper. That's called Papermaker's tears. And that's the kiss off. If you don't like your sheet of paper, you kiss it off. Another problem you might have, especially when you have a lot of pulp on your mold, when you're going like this, and that won't do it, but you can lose part of your pulp onto your felt as you're flipping it over. So that has to be a nice smooth motion when you do that. This is probably the hardest thing to get used to. This part right here is you're going down into the that. And every time you do that, you need to stir it back up so it'll get evenly distributed through the water. You go down this way, but see, you don't come straight back up because, see, that's what happens. You don't get an even sheet. So you go down, and I kind of make it almost a rocking motion. And see, that's pretty even. This probably you'll need to just practice this a lot before you really actually get a good sheet of paper. You can kind of manipulate the pulp as it's, while the water, before the water all drains through, you have a little bit of a motion that you can go through to settle it down, to even it up. The reason that the cotton works better than the computer cards or the other processed paper is that the other paper's been processed to death almost. It's machine made, and these, the fibers, still, you can still see individual fibers. Not as much in the cotton as you can in the Oriental papers, but you still notice that there's fibers in there. You can also make texture at this point. This is just a you can do that, or you can lay your texture down. And flip, and line it up a little bit. It helps when you have a thick sheet there, because the thinner it is, if you were to try to make the texture with a very, very thin sheet right here, you might not come off the mold. See, it has, the paper really needs to grip onto something. That's why the felts are so good, because they have these little fibers that kind of reach up and grab the paper too. And this plastic doesn't, so it's kind of like a foreign surface there that it doesn't really accept the paper as well as the porous surface does. But then you just kind of press it out, and again you have to be careful because it's just well, you get the idea. And then you can still put your felt on top of it. You can make more paper, but now that you've got this texture under there, it's probably going to, it might come through a little bit. Now at this point you'd want to put it in a press and squeeze out this extra water. And let me do that right now. Okay, at this point you can squeeze it out with a sponge, but it would take a long time. Now you could tell on these two pieces over here where I didn't have a press, and I just pressed out the water with the sponge and laid it onto the board. Okay, the next step, if you want to go a little bit further into equipment and whatever, you take this, which is called a post of paper, all the felts and the paper sandwiched in between. It's called a post of paper, and you put it in a press. All right, this is a very simple press made out of just wooden boards that are waterproofed. Everything has to be waterproofed. And these threaded metal bars, I'm sure that you could make one of these. And you also have a metal plate here. You can buy an inexpensive hydraulic jack, and the plans for this simple press are in the booklet. This is the way that works. Okay, now you can see it making contact up there. the water should drip out. See? And the more you squeeze, the more water drips. Put a little pressure on it. You see all of this water coming out. And you can let it sit or you can release it. And now, you see again, there's nothing, the paper really wants to grab onto the felt more than to the mold that I had it on. And you take it, you can set it aside, or again, you can put it on your Formica board. Now this one you don't want to brush out because of the texture on it. And so you might want to lay these flat out in the sun, because you won't, if you put it in front of a fan, it would probably blow off. After you take the other sheets off the felts, attach them to the boards. You can put them out in the sun or in front of a fan. When they've dried, you can peel them off and you'll have a smooth surface on your paper. Papermaking can be adapted for a simple, inexpensive project for kids. The equipment is made from a large tin can, a wire or plastic support grid, and a piece of fiberglass or regular screening. You'll also need a smaller can with the top and bottom cut out. Set it up in this order and you'll have a simple pouring mold. The bottom can serves as your vat. The support grid and screening are your mold, and the top can is your decal. You can use almost any kind of paper and a kitchen blender to illustrate the process of recycling. Pour the blended pulp quickly into the top can, allowing the water to drain into the bottom can. You only need a little pulp in this process. After you've blended up your pulp with plenty of water, use only about 1/4 to 1/2 cup of the mixture. When most of the water is drained through, lift off the top can and you'll have a sheet of recycled paper. The top of your sheet will be rough and uneven. Take a piece of material like this blue jean leg and lay it over the top of your paper. Now your piece is sandwiched in between the material and the screen. Turn it over so that the screen is on the top. Lift off the screen to leave the paper on the blue jean material and set it aside to dry. Another way to make sheets of paper is to use an embroidery hoop as a mold. Stretch fiberglass screen across the frame and trim off the excess. Try to have plenty of material on hand for felts. Using blue jean remnants continues a recycling theme. Here we're using old Christmas cards to add color. If you're using embroidery hoops or square frame molds, you'll need vats of pulps to dip them down into. Make sure to flip them over carefully. When you dip the screens down into a vat, make sure that the screen is on top of the framework. Otherwise, your pulp will be trapped down inside and won't come off until you're felt. Here you can see how the pulp sits on top of the screen. When you flip it over onto your felt material, it will come off easily as you lift off the mold. Making paper with children of all ages can be fun and an educational project. Not only can they understand what paper is and how it is made, but it gives kids the chance to creatively experiment while teaching a valuable lesson in recycling. No, you can let it do like that. You can let it dry, but this is After you've given kids the basic instructions, turn them loose and let them create on their own.
give it.
Yeah.
You might want to hold it up for him so you can see it.
What you need a sponge, I think.
You can keep that sponge.
You can sponge it off a little
Can I
bit.
see that sponge?
Just take your hand and dip it.
When y'all get some of your paper ready,
That's supposed to be green.
what we'll do is lay it on this screen.
Yeah. That's supposed to be good.
We'll lay it on the screen to dry, and then we set it out in the sun.
It's supposed to be good.
What do you want to do?
I love it. I'm finished. I'm ready.
Put this down, and that way you can lift it up there. Oh, that's good. Hold it up so you can take it.
Well, me
There we
too.
go.
Look at mine.
You made your first sheet of paper.